This video is brought to you by Squarespace, an all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. Hello, sweet angels. My name is Mina, and I talk about fashion, culture, and media commentary here on this channel. So today I decided I was going to tackle a video topic that I actually get a lot of requests for, which is the appropriation of Catholic symbols in fashion. The most prominent example I can think of is the Met Costume Institute's 2018 exhibit, Heavenly Bodies, which was like heavily covered by the mainstream media. Also, the Versace outfit that Zendaya wore to that event lives rent-free in my mind, and I tried to kind of channel it today, but you know, we don't have that kind of budget, and we also don't look like Zendaya, so... And I will be talking about heavenly bodies and the role of Catholicism in like the high fashion industry, but also I want to talk about a phenomenon that started a couple years ago, which is this trend of young, cool people flaunting Catholic aesthetics and even converting to Catholicism. As an example, a Depop user reached Twitter virality for selling Catholic confession readings. Under her product description, she wrote, "I would love to help any fellow coquette, clean girl, aesthetic girlies to absolve you of your sins for a cheap price of $5. I would love to help any fellow coquette, clean girl, aesthetic girlies to absolve you of your sins." Not only is it crazy to me to charge for confession, because you can literally get that done for free at your local Catholic church, but even if you don't agree with the hierarchy of the church, I think it's common sense to say that it's probably better if you're going to get a confession reading to get it done by someone who's been studying the Bible for years and has reached some kind of level of certification versus getting a reading from a girl on the internet who is only baptized, allegedly. Also, the fact that coquette and clean girl aesthetics are two completely different things and don't go together, questionable source. Do not get your confessions from this person. But anyway, there's a lot to discuss, so let's just get started. In this day and age, it feels like everyone needs a website, and Squarespace simplifies that daunting task by offering easy-to-use features. You don't need to take a class or hire anyone else to help you. To get you started, Squarespace offers a bunch of website templates, and if none of them match your vibe, you can add customizations like different fonts, colors, and images. They even have custom color palettes to help you. If you want to open a store, Squarespace offers features to streamline that as well. You can sell anything from physical products to subscription memberships. Or if you're a freelancer or artist, you can present your work using Squarespace's professional portfolio designs. They even have password-protected pages if you want to share private work with specific clients. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Minalei to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. One pope ago, Pope Benedict XVI was known for a number of things. I'm sure many of those things had to do with his actual leadership of the Catholic Church. But the other thing, the arguably more fun thing, was that he had quite the fashion sense. So much so that in 2007, Esquire named him as one of the best dressed men in America, which I know doesn't even make sense because he's not in America. But whatever, the point still stands.
You better work.
And one of the sartorial things he was most known for were his shoes. A pair of red papal loafers that actually made headlines because people initially thought they were Prada. The Washington Post even addressed the rumors shortly after his coronation in 2005. Whether it's Prada and Gucci or just fancy ecclesiastical tailoring, Pope Benedict XVI is his own man when it comes to dressing. The vintage styles have turned Benedict into something of a fashion celebrity. The shoes were not Prada and were actually made locally by Roman cobblers, but the rumors probably started because Benedict's predecessor, Pope John Paul II, who served an almost 30-year term, opted for a muted burgundy pair instead when he was in office. Do they say in office? When he was reigning? So in comparison, despite being very on protocol, Benedict's fire truck red shoes looked a little ostentatious for office. With that said, the Pope was photographed wearing Serengeti sunglasses, Adidas baseball caps, and allegedly also received, but was not photographed wearing, 20 pairs of swimming trunks from the company Filani. He also owned an iPod Nano given to him by Vatican Radio on the station's 75th birthday. Rocco Palmo, a Vatican watcher and correspondent for the Catholic newspaper The Tablet, gave a possible explanation for why the two popes differed so much in presentation. He said, John Paul shirked many of the ancient trappings of the papacy for a handful of reasons. He wasn't keen to allow the props to upstage what he saw as the main draw, his message and himself. Benedict, on the other hand, had none of John Paul's charisma, and according to Palmo, Benedict was a man to whom the constant mass attention of the papacy did not come easy and who, in consequence, took immense pains to get his appearance right. Honestly, kind of shady for Palmo to say. Peter Popham offered a nicer explanation for The Independent, writing that vanity may have something to do with all this, but more likely it is the shy theologian exploring the symbology of his church's oldest traditions, sending out messages through the items he chooses to use. The Guardian also contended that Benedict's papal uniform represented an effort to revive the Catholic Church's hegemonic heritage and tradition within visual culture. Benedict himself even repeated both as cardinal and as Roman pontiff that art and the saints are the greatest apologetic for our faith. But despite all the hoopla, Benedict was far from the first pope to be fashionable. Prior to the 1960s, it was actually common for the pope to wear intricate and decorative clothing. But in the mid-60s, the Catholic clergy convened at the Second Vatican Council to discuss the modernization of the church. Pope Paul VI, who was pope under this phase, eliminated these more ostentatious robes and accessories and even auctioned a papal tiara, which the New York Times estimated was roughly $80,000 in 1964, and then donated those proceeds to charities and organizations assisting the poor. As a priest told The Guardian, the church processed into the Second Vatican Council in cloth of gold and watered silk and shambled out the other end in drip-dry horse blankets and polyester. Not polyester.
Forming like this big polyester meteor in our closet, you know.
However, at a time of global economic uncertainty and with the church struggling to retain its members in an increasingly secular world, Benedict may have felt that reinforcing tradition and underlining the continuity of ritual was a bold and necessary direction. The result of his dressing meant that companies were scrambling to get the Pope's endorsement, which I honestly thought was really dystopian when researching all this because I had no idea. Popham reported in 2006, manufacturers of everything from luxury cars to loafers are climbing over each other to obtain the discreet endorsement of a man whose needs are so few that everything he lays hands on gets noticed. John Allert, the chief executive of the British unit of Interbrand, a global branding consultancy, even told the Wall Street Journal that for a product to be associated with the Pope was at least 100 times better than being sported by an A-list celebrity, because his following is more devoted. Imagine having a parasocial relationship with the Pope!
I saw Katie Heron wearing army pants and flip-flops, so I bought army pants and flip-flops.
In defense of Pope Benedict, I will mention that Pope John Paul II had his own material vices. He was known to enjoy a fondness for Rolex watches, which teen Vogue cites as an iconic papal fashion moment. As for our current Pope, Pope Francis has brought back a humble fashion sense. Yes, sorry to bear the bad news, but the photos of him wearing a puffer coat were in fact AI generated. Francis opts for wool instead of silk, simple wood or metal crosses instead of gold gem-encrusted ones, black shoes instead of red. Catholic news outlet Crux refers to his laid-back style as papal athleisure. The most interesting trivia I learned is that his tailor, Filippo Sorcinelli, who is also Benedict's tailor, is gay. And in 2013, someone or some people sent in 2,500 anonymous letters to newspapers outing Sorcinelli in efforts to, I guess, cancel him. But I guess the Vatican thought his work was so good that they continued to work with Sorcinelli anyway. Though interestingly, today Italy interviewed him and asked if any priests have ever made advances towards him, and he said, "It happens, but I make it clear that it is a mistake." Sorcinelli also created a room and clothing spray for the popes, which then inspired him to open up his own perfume business called Unum, which includes in their line a scent that is based on gay eroticism. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting to talk about the fashion styles of the popes because they are arguably the most fashionable members of the Catholic Church, and also a lot of their clothing tends to be reappropriated in the high fashion space. I think we should discuss the opulence of the Catholic Church because it helps explain why Catholicism tends to be more appropriated by the fashion industry than, let's say, Protestant denominations. Okay, so to understand the aesthetics of Catholicism, we have to go way back. In 311 AD, I wasn't exaggerating, way back, Emperor Constantine established the Christian church as a power in the state, and the result was that they needed to erect institutions where people could practice this now dominant religion. The problem was, they couldn't just build Christian churches on top of the ancient pagan temples because the functions of these temples differed from the functions of the church. Many ancient temples had pretty small interiors that usually hosted a shrine to a specific god, while larger processions and sacrifices took place outside. In contrast, the church needed a large interior space because that's where everyone would congregate for service while the priest read mass. The church also condemned the worship of these specific gods, so everything about these existing temples were like giving Christian red flags. What they ended up doing was model new churches based on the large assembly halls of the time known as basilicas or royal halls. Probably the architectural styles that many of us associate with Catholicism the most are the Gothic style that arose in the 12th and 13th centuries and the Baroque style that arose in the 17th century. These types of ornate cathedrals were meant to inspire and show the kind of triumphant power that the Catholic Church wielded. As professor of Italian studies, Stephen J. Baker explains, ornamentation in Catholic sacred architecture serves to increase a building's emotional impact upon an individual's transformational process during the liturgical ritual. What also sets the Catholic Church apart from some other groups of Christians is its emphasis on religious art. In the early Constantine days, when they were just trying to figure out what to fill these new churches with, statues were for sure out of the question. They reminded everyone of paganism, and idolatry was also a concern. The term idolatry means the worship of idols. And the reason idolatry is prohibited by the church is because there's a fear that people will worship the image and then attach divine attributes to said image instead of worshiping the one true God. However, it's unclear what exactly is considered idolatry, but early Christians could at least agree that statues were definitely considered, and so out of the question. But what about paintings? There were some Christians who believed paintings also counted as idolatry, but Pope Gregory the Great, who lived at the end of the 6th century AD, believed that paintings were integral for religious teaching and inspiring devotion, especially because many members of the church could not read or write. And so artists following his lead painted frescoes to cover the church's walls. Fast forward to 1517. A German priest named Martin Luther published the 95 Theses, which challenged almost every aspect of the Catholic Church, leading to the Protestant Reformation, in which more and more people found something about the church to hate on. Among these complaints was the idea that the church was encouraging idolatry with all their religious art. There was also the idea that the church was hypocritical because they were preaching Christian values of poverty. Meanwhile, cathedrals were literally dripping in gold, silver, and other precious materials. The Pope was also accused of living lavishly. In retaliation, the Catholic Church hard-launched the Counter-Reformation, in which they attempted to strengthen their own doctrines against the Protestants. When it came to religious art, they decreed that the Protestants were wrong because the Old Testament God had requested that his house be decorated richly. Elaine Oliphant, NYU professor of religious studies, explains, while the Protestant Reformation critiqued excesses of wealth and opulence in churches and art, in many ways the Catholic Church replied by further emphasizing the richness and beauty of art. The Counter-Reformation movement inevitably sparked a resurgence of Catholic fervor throughout Europe, and its cultural manifestation was Baroque art. Artists like Caravaggio, Renne, Carracci, and Barocci were recruited to affirm salvation in the Catholic Church through beauty. This championing of more extravagant religious art extended beyond painting, scriptures, and architecture to also include the ceremonial robes and jewels worn by the clergy. Oliphant explains, just at the point when nation-states were taking over the rights of taxation, were expropriating church properties, and capitalism was expanding rapidly throughout Europe, the Vatican again sort of doubled down in its use of art to celebrate its power. Today, the Vatican still wears traditional ecclesiastical clothing for reasons I mentioned earlier in the video. In contrast, many Protestant reformers abandoned ecclesiastical dress because they wanted to downplay the visual distinction between church leaders and the laity. What that means is that in a very general sense, Catholics have a clear visual culture which makes their aesthetics more ripe for the picking. High fashion is very elite. I don't know if you guys knew this. But especially couture, and lots of times, the luxury industry will seek out codes to distinguish their expensive garments from their lesser counterparts. It therefore makes sense to use Catholic imagery to convey the sense of expensiveness and eliteness because of the long-standing history tying elite culture and Catholicism. For the Met's Heavenly Bodies exhibit, the Sistine Chapel actually loaned several items of clothing, including the golden cape of Pope Benedict XV, who reigned from 1914 to 1922, the chasuble and mitre of his successor, Pius XI, and the 19th century dalmatic of Pius IX, as well as his heavily jeweled tiara. All of this is to say, according to Andrew Bolton, head curator of the Met's Costume Institute, that the finest costumes in history were always either imperial or ecclesiastical, sometimes both.
Catholics see the world through enchanted eyes. Catholicism conveys really deep concepts, but it's reflected in these beautiful stories that are much more accessible.
The Met's Costume Institute is co-chaired by Vogue EIC Anna Wintour, and the exhibit, Heavenly Bodies, can be seen as a continuation of her legacy in the fashion world. I say that because Wintour's debut Vogue cover in November 1988 featured a model in a jacket adorned with a large cross. Professor of Religious Studies Lynn S. Neal characterizes this cover as the transformation and decontextualization of religious symbols. Using religious symbols in this way corresponds with the diminishing role of religious institutions and the rise of spirituality, where people seek authentic inner life and personhood rather than group identity and social location. Originally, Heavenly Bodies was conceived as an exhibition that would actually explore the influence of religion on fashion more generally, but over time, the curators realized there was this major imbalance between designers who were from the Catholic tradition and those from other faiths. I mean, I think this really highlights the lack of diversity in high fashion and fashion in general. I mean, the reason fashion designers integrate Catholic aesthetics obviously varies from designer to designer, but I think it's important to mention that many of the successful fashion designers we know today were either from or trained in France, Italy, and Spain, which are three countries in which Catholicism was and still is the dominant religion. For example, Coco Chanel, who grew up in France, spent her youth in the Aubazine Abbey, and it was in this orphanage that she learned how to sew and where she found inspiration. Fashion writer Eliane Badu noted that Chanel ended up reusing the slender and straight cut of the nuns' dresses in many of her collections, notably in her little black dress, to which she sometimes added a white collar, also recalling the institution. This style and color palette, along with Christian-inspired accessories, have become a staple of Chanel's brand. More recently, beginning in the 1990s, Versace and the controversial Dolce & Gabbana are two brands that integrate their Italian Catholic heritages. Versace's 1991 to 1992 ready-to-wear collection, for example, featured a biker jacket with a bejeweled Mary and an infant Jesus on the back. Their fall 1997 couture show featured cross necklaces, Byzantine cross embellishments, and little black dresses with white collars, reminiscent of Chanel's aforementioned homages to the Abbey and its nuns. For Dolce & Gabbana, while they've made Christian-themed clothing in the past, it was their fall 2013 ready-to-wear collection that was considered to be the biggest exhibition of religious accessories in the history of high fashion, with its incense burner-shaped bags, cross earrings, crowns, and Baroque shoes. I believe Kourtney Kardashian and Travis Barker, their wedding, which was, I think, sponsored by Dolce & Gabbana because she wears Dolce & Gabbana, that was also very, Catholic themed. Other designers who have used Catholic symbols in at least one collection include Cristobal Balenciaga, Jean-Paul Gaultier, Alexander McQueen, John Galliano for Dior, Tom Brown, Alessandro Michele for Gucci, and Rick Owens. As we can see, even non-Italians can find inspiration with Catholicism, and that's probably because of how culturally pervasive the religion is in the Western world. Catholicism's material culture and proximity to the mystical and supernatural also makes it just taboo enough to be enticing. In his article From Friars to Fornicators, The Eroticization of Sacred Dress, William Keenan explains, part of the lure of the religious dress fetish lies in the frisson obtained when carnal and spiritual bodies juxtapose and commingle, when the lusts of the flesh commune with the garments of God, when the conventional morality of dress is overturned. Such challenges to norms produce a pleasurable grinding, a sense of edgy rebellion, and the possibility of questioning the boundaries that separate categories. In a similar vein, fascination with Catholicism and its aesthetics took hold in conjunction with the Second Vatican Council in the mid-20th century, exemplified in films like Rosemary's Baby, The Godfather, and The Exorcist, among others. Also, just as a sidebar, I grew up around Washington, D.C., and The Exorcist, I think, takes place in D.C., or at least it takes place on a specific staircase. There's a staircase where The Exorcist was filmed, and it's like this really like vertical, steep staircase. And I remember there was like a rumor that like the crew team in my high school would have to like jog up and down the Exorcist stairs for training. But now that I think about it, I'm like, that can't be real, because I feel like you could actually die if you fell down those stairs. Anyway, Catholicism was especially prominent in the horror genre and when juxtaposed with sins like sexuality and violence. Catholic iconography and religious language also has a long history in music, specifically for songs with sexual themes and erotic imagery, and many times trends in music lend its way to trends in fashion. For example, in the 1980s, pop singer Madonna adopted cross accessories and used subversive religious imagery in her music videos and performances. Many people liked her rebellious stance against conservatism and her unapologetic female sexuality, and thus looked to emulate her style.
She gets what she wants and she does it. The way she dresses and the way she acts. It is, of course.
Of course, some conservative Christians found Madonna's wearing of these religious symbols trivializing and even blasphemous.
I am aware that the Vatican and certain Catholic communities are accusing my show of being sinful and blasphemous. If you are sure that I am a sinner, then let he who has not sinned cast the first stone.
Another artist, a more recent artist that is often tied to the Catholic aesthetic, is Lana Del Rey. A young writer for Teen Ink explained the phenomenon. Del Rey's religious imagery in her lyrics has appeared in the hashtag Catholic aesthetic, which features Virgin Mary statues, wooden crosses, and young girls dressed in white nightgowns locked in simple bedrooms and looking longingly out of windows. Her music encapsulates the mood of this aesthetic and cements its undertone of docility. In short, the hashtag Catholic aesthetic is about three things: softness, sexiness, and submission. So yeah, in case you missed it, beginning around 2021, there was a rise in the Catholic aesthetic among young people. I would personally describe the Catholic aesthetic as a subset of the coquette subculture. Its use of Catholic symbols is definitely not as opulent as in Versace's couture collections. It's like more of an accessible style that integrates a lot of pastel blues and pinks, lace, slip dresses, cross necklaces, Catholic schoolgirl uniforms, rosary beads, ribbons, and baby tees with religious idioms on them. The brand Praying is actually a good example, and I actually think that this brand is partly responsible for the larger trend of memifying Catholic culture. But what I also think is really weird is that this brand is run by two men, and the clothes are clearly meant to like sexualize women, but also like sexualize women's innocence. It's a very weird brand. They sell a viral Holy Trinity bikini and a Hail Mary dress as a few examples. Their designs generally follow a Dadaist tradition in street fashion made popular by ironic brands Vetements and Off-White, though I think they border on the more offensive just because of the religious connotations. Rebecca Jennings wrote about the memification of Catholicism and interviewed Kyle Hyde, who runs the Catholic meme page I Need God in Every Moment of My Life on Instagram. Hyde attributes his follower growth to quarantine, saying that being home alone without your routine makes you confront your faith or other deeper things that society isn't dealing with. Last December, Eliza McLamb wrote an essay on her experience at a Catholic church with her extended family in West Virginia. And in it, she talks about how young people, including herself, feel a pull towards meaning-making and ritual to deal with the trials and tribulations of modern society. And I think she's absolutely right. I also think that there's just so much fear nowadays towards AI and social media and other like Black Mirror coded technology that sometimes reverting back to a traditional belief that has lasted like 2,000 years can feel comforting, especially for those of us who grew up in a religion but have since stopped practicing. So revisiting that religion can feel like revisiting our youth in some way, which we might see through like nostalgic rose-colored glasses. I mean, in my case, I've yet to romanticize this part of my life. All I remember is like dingy church basements, boring services, and not being able to go to sleepovers on Saturday nights because I had CCD the next morning. There's also, of course, people who adopt Catholic fashion and culture as more of a vibe than a sincere gesture. Writer Biz Sherbert wrote in 2021 about how Catholic aesthetic reclamation could be a result of public reckonings towards cultural appropriation. Because by the late 2010s, it was generally understood that a white person should not wear a feather headdress or a bindi. So Sherbert writes, alternative white kids have had to adapt and look for new ways to differentiate themselves from the sea of normies and basics. Trendsetters began to avoid ripping off styles from people of color. Their pursuit of otherness now took place within the strict limits of familiar, quaint horizons. Sherbert also interviewed artist Samuel Marion for ID, who added, "Taste-making habits have become magnetized towards forms of appropriation that have no overt racial ties. Hence the blue-collar Dickies fascination, normcore, cowboy LARPing, Walden cosplay." While most Christians worldwide practice Catholicism, most Christian Americans belong to a Protestant denomination. Protestant rhetoric has imbued itself culturally here in the US, from views towards marriage to legal laws to like the Hollywood formula of good triumphs over evil. And so contextually, Catholicism seems like the edgier, more alternative branch of Christianity, on top of just being a more aesthetically inclined religion in general. I will add, though, that last year we saw an adjacent aesthetic called Catholic Mexican Girlcore. I feel like it's that meme where it's like none of those words are in the Bible, but it like it's even more like ironic because we're literally talking about the Bible. Catholic Mexican Girlcore, which is an aesthetic that's partially inspired by Brazilian designer Marcelo Gaia's Mirror Palette collection and partially inspired by Hispanic actresses like Penelope Cruz and Selma Hayek. The major difference from the Catholic coquette is that this aesthetic is less cute and more sexy, shows more skin, but I would also say it verges on cultural appropriation because of the way it whittles down the diversity of Latin America. It could even be seen as like a fetishization of Spanish colonization. I don't think anything in like the Mirror Palette collections are explicitly culturally appropriative. I think it's just like the fact that people have decided to name this aesthetic Mexican Catholic girl. Like, why couldn't it just be clothes that are pretty? I don't know. There could have been another name for it. Or there could have just not been any name at all. That's a hot take. But speaking of insincerity, another more niche influence of the postmodern Catholic aesthetic is the Dime Square scene in New York City. Dime Square is an area of the Lower East Side named after the local restaurant Dimes, and the art culture around there for the past few years has been pretty reactionary, contrarian, and right-leaning as a response to the progressive hegemony and young urban spaces. Julia Yost covered the scene in an article for the New York Times in 2022. In it, she refers to podcast hosts Honor Levy and Dasha Nekrasova, who have both recently publicized their Catholic faith. However, some people believe these women's religious choices were insincere, and it's not difficult to see why. Considering the fact that Dasha once called herself Catholic like Andy Warhol, and considering how Warhol was a self-proclaimed deeply superficial pop artist, it seems like Catholicism is more of a vibe to them than like a genuine choice of faith.
How much of your move to Catholicism is a like cultural gesture versus a more, authentic like submission to the church authority?
Still something I'm navigating. I think, a lot of people think I'm being Catholic ironically,
right,
which is true. That it doesn't really matter if you're doing something ironically because it still works.
Levy pointed out on her podcast that if you perform enough rituals, then it becomes real, even if you don't initially believe in it. So who knows? Yost also writes something interesting about it. She says, the idea that it is a properly religious act to observe the forms of faith, even in the absence of perfect belief, most likely comes naturally to a generation raised on social media, where performance is a constant fact of life. So basically, because of social media's over-reliance on aesthetics and performance to create meaning, it's unsurprising that some people would think being performatively a Catholic is enough to qualify as Catholic. Much to think about. What's especially funny to me when I was going into this like research wormhole is that I came across this conservative Catholic writer, Steve Larkin, who actually criticized the Dime Square Catholic revival for, I guess, like not being Catholic enough. Like, the Catholic girls are fighting. He wrote, whether it's a pose or a belief, it indicates another problem with vibes Catholicism. It is mediated almost entirely through spending time online. New York Times profiles of the most Twitter-visible Catholics may make you think that Catholicism is the religion of an intellectual elite. It's not. It's the religion of about 1.3 billion people, most of whom are neither intellectual nor elite. Really, this kind of media treatment almost makes me miss the days when Catholicism was the religion of illiterate peasants, kept in darkness and superstition by their priests. I feel like there's always an argument I see whenever someone wears like a nun costume for Halloween or even wears like a cross necklace in a goth sort of way, which is that, is it okay to wear Catholic-inspired fashion? I was raised Catholic. I don't practice anymore, and I've talked to a lot of people about this issue. Most of my friends who were also raised Catholic also don't practice anymore either, and their view is that Christianity, being such a dominant religion with such a violent, oppressive history, cannot be appropriated, and I, for the most part, agree with that as well. But I can't say that current practicing Catholics feel the same kind of nonchalance. Over and over again, we hear about Catholics criticizing music artists like Madonna.
Madonna, why do you want to burn in hell?
Lady Gaga, Lil Nas X, and even the Met's Heavenly Bodies exhibit face disdain.
Our Blessed Mother, she's been so offended by the blasphemies that occurred here at the Met.
Several Catholic organizations coordinated the Met Reparation Rally, where more than 600 people participated in a protest outside the museum, which I think is a little ridiculous because, I don't know, I feel like museum exhibits, the point of them is to convey knowledge. They're educational spaces. Like, I don't think it's like a judgmental space, you know? Like, they're not saying like it's inherently good or inherently bad to integrate fashion and to integrate Christianity into fashion. Like, they're just presenting what's literally been the case. And so I think that was kind of silly to be protesting. But I think on a very general level, like not counting extremists, what really matters to most people is sincerity, because I noticed that fashion brands like Versace and Gucci get a free pass more often because their designers are Italian and their clothing pays homage to like the beautiful aspects of the Italian Catholic heritage. Meanwhile, I noticed the conversation around Namilia's spring 2024 collection was that it was offensive and corny, and this is a sentiment that was conveyed from like Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Namilia is a brand known for creating provocative clothes. For example, they incorporate a lot of genitalia in their designs, so I can see why choosing to use Catholic imagery would come across much more distastefully. It also just might be that that particular clothing collection was ugly, and using Catholic imagery is only okay if your designs are beautiful. But either way, Catholicism has lasted for over 2,000 years now, and its meaning in the culture experiences shifts and changes, and sometimes those changes are orchestrated by the church itself, like with Vatican II. And that means that while it may be edgy and cool now, today, to rock Catholicism, doesn't mean it will be in 10 years or 20 years, depending on what the church says or how religious or anti-religious or anti-ironic we become as a culture. As Julia Yost writes, real-world events will confront young urban Catholics with the full implications of Catholic doctrine, making it hard to view the rosary as a fashion statement. Over time, these developments will sort the converts from the LARPers. Okay, that's all I have for today, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to me talk, listening to me ramble. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Okay, see ya. Bye.